You've taken a test, right? Of course you have. An SAT, an IQ test, maybe even one of those personality quizzes online. But have you ever stopped and wondered, where did this whole idea even come from? Well, the origin story is probably not what you think. It's this incredible story of two totally different scientific quests that really had no business ever meeting, but they did. And that collision created every single test we know today.
So, it all boils down to this one huge question. For centuries, this was just stuff for philosophers to argue about. But then, in the 19th century, a couple of very different groups of thinkers decided to tackle it scientifically, and they came at it from completely opposite ends of the universe.
And this, right here, this is the core conflict of our whole story. It's like two rivers flowing in opposite directions. In one river, you had scientists who were absolutely obsessed with what makes each of us unique, our differences. And in the other, you had researchers in labs trying to find the universal mathematical laws that apply to every single human mind, basically pretending those differences didn't even exist. All right, so let's dive into that first river of thought. This is the quest to measure what makes us unique. And what's wild is that it doesn't start in some sterile white lab coat environment. Nope, it starts out in the messy, beautiful chaos of nature itself.
Believe it or not, the story of your SAT score actually starts with Charles Darwin. And look, he wasn't trying to invent some standardized test, not at all. He was trying to figure out the mind-bending diversity of all life on our planet.
So the big idea, the one that changes everything, comes from his 1859 book, The Origin of Species. He basically argued that all those tiny little differences between individuals are not just quirks, they are everything. Some variations give an individual an edge, helping them survive and pass on those traits. And that idea right there, that individual differences are the engine of life, that's the seed for all modern testing.
Okay, so Darwin plants the seed, and then his relative, Sir Francis Galton, comes along and just sprints with it. He took that idea and applied it directly to people. He got it in his head that, hey, if animals differ in physical fitness, then humans must differ in mental fitness. And he was determined to prove it and measure it.
And man, this idea caught on like wildfire. Seriously, look how fast this happened. In just a few decades, we rocket from Darwin's big theory about nature to Galton applying it to human genius all the way to an American psychologist, James McKeen Cattell, actually coining the phrase we still use today, the mental test.
All right, so that's river number one. Let's park that for a second and wade into a totally different stream of thought. Because while Galton was out there measuring differences, a whole other group was holed up in a lab hunting for the exact opposite, a universal mind.
So yeah, picture it. We're leaving the fields of England behind and we're stepping into this super controlled, precise German laboratory. The whole game here is different. They're not trying to rank people. They're trying to discover the fundamental source code of consciousness itself.
And their method? Oh, it was meticulous, like beyond systematic. First, they'd take one tiny sensation, like a sound or a flash of light. Then they'd measure the absolute minimum amount of it a person could detect, what we call a threshold. From there, they'd cook up these elegant mathematical laws to predict how we sense the world. And this whole thing demanded absolute, rigorous, standardized control, a method perfected by a guy named Wilhelm Wundt in his famous lab back in 1879.
You see, for these guys, all those little differences between people that Galton was so obsessed with, that was just static. It was noise in the data, an error to be eliminated. They wanted the clean signal, the beautiful, universal rules of the mind that applied to every single person, no exceptions, a total paradox to what Galton was trying to do.
So now we've got these two massive ideas, right? Two rivers flowing in completely opposite directions. One celebrating our differences, the other trying to erase them. But they couldn't stay separate forever. Something had to give. And, as it turns out, it took a real-world practical problem to force these two rivers to collide.
I mean, seriously, what on earth could possibly mash these two things together? The tradition of ranking individuals versus the tradition of finding universal scientific laws? Well, the answer wasn't some grand philosophical debate. It was a really down-to-earth, urgent need.
So let's jump to the turn of the 20th century. Over in France, the government's got a brand new problem. Universal education had just become law, and they needed a way to identify kids who might need some extra help, some special education. But how do you do that fairly and objectively?
And bam, this is the moment. This is where it all comes together. To solve their problem, they needed Galton's idea, right? The idea that intelligence is different from person to person and that you can measure it. But, and this is a huge but,
To make it fair and reliable, you also needed Wundt's idea from the lab. The measurement, the test, had to be a standardized, controlled scientific procedure for everyone.
And this is where our main character steps onto the stage. The one guy who was standing right where these two rivers were about to crash into each other, ready to create the solution we still use today.
His name was Alfred Binet. He was part of the French Commission on this problem, and he was the perfect person at the perfect time. He just got it. He understood both traditions and realized the solution wasn't to pick a side. The solution was to fuse them together. So what was his recipe? Simple but genius. From that Darwin-Galton tradition, he took the main mission. Let's measure individual differences in mental ability. But from the German experimentalists, he took the method. We have to do it with a standardized, controlled procedure for every single child. He and his colleague T. Simone put them together, and they created something the world had never seen before.
And in 1905, they published it, the Binet-Simon scale. This wasn't just another little experiment. This was it. The world's first, honest-to-goodness, modern intelligence test. You're looking at the birth date of an entire industry.
Okay, so that's a cool history lesson, but why does any of this matter to you right now? Well, because the DNA from both of those competing, even contradictory quests is baked into every single test you take today.
Seriously, that's the one thing to remember here. Any test you've ever taken is a direct descendant of that historical compromise, that mashup of two once totally opposite ways of looking at the human mind.
Yeah, you can think of it exactly like DNA with two strands. One strand is that quest for finding and ranking our differences, that's pure Galton. The other strand is that commitment to scientific rigor, to standardization. That comes straight from Wundt's lab. And here's the key, you can't have a modern test without both.
I mean, just think about it. The SAT, its whole purpose is to measure differences in how ready you are for college, but it does it under ridiculously strict standardized conditions, right? Or, one of those personality assessments for a job. It ranks your traits, but it uses a scientifically validated, controlled method. Both rivers are always flowing through them. So all of this history, this collision of ideas, it leaves us with a really big, kind of personal question, doesn't it? Knowing that every test is a product of these two historical forces, the drive to rank us and the drive to apply universal science, we have to ask ourselves, these tests were built to measure us, but how much do we let them define who we are?